Today we're talking about design volume. Now everything in design uh, has a design fill in the blank. You may have a design load or a design weight, but in transportation we have a design volume. And by volume we mean volume of vehicles. And so the number of vehicles that is going to be traveling through a location or in a lane. And so uh, we need to design or create a design volume. But I got a question to ask you to begin with. Would you think it is better to design for the worst case scenario or the most probable scenario in transportation? All right, give you a chance to think about it. The answer is not worst case scenario. We would not design for the worst case scenario because if you think about it, the worst case scenario could be a hurricane evacuation or some kind of huge event where everybody needs to leave the scenario or the scene. And so we wouldn't want to design a roadway that for the worst case scenario because that roadway will have many different lanes, right? Just if everybody in one city or in town wanted to leave all at the same location and at the same time, it's going to be multiple lanes that's needed to get that big of a rush out of one location. And so worst case scenario is probably not the best thing to use as our design volume. What's better is to use the most probable scenario. And one thing we know is that if we were to plot vehicles or the number of vehicles in a lane against the hour, or just look at this as time of day, where this is very, very early in the morning, and this is the 24-hour period. And so, of course, you got, your middle period there, noon, lunchtime. What you'll see is that there will be a peak here, and then another maybe another peak there, and then it starts to drop, and then there's another peak at another location right around the quitting time where most people are leaving work. And so you have about 3 peaks there where traffic is at its highest. Rush hour, lunch rush hour, and then afternoon rush hour. And so that is probable. We know that there's going to be a peak hour sometime throughout the day. And that is what we're going to use to create our design hourly volume later on. One way to look at the design hourly volume, or just to estimate it, is to look at the 30th highest hourly volume. Now that may seem strange, so let me try and explain it with this graph here. So on this graph you have the hourly traffic as the percent of the annual daily traffic. And so this is the percent of vehicles that are observed on a roadway in one day. All right, and they're plotting those numbers against all the hours ranked. So this would be the first highest hour, second highest hour, 10th highest hour, 20th highest hour, 40th highest hour within a year. And so this thing can keep on going, but it's only showing up to 160. So these are all the hours in the year. And they plotted all of those hours in the year against the percent of daily traffic on an hourly basis. And what they find is that in every single scenario, whether they're looking at the trend line for speeds or 85th percent of location, or whether they're looking at the road with an average fluctuation in traffic flow trend line, it doesn't matter. Every single one of those trend lines there, they're seeing at the breaking point, or the point at which the change in the trend is greatest, or the greatest inflection point here is usually at the 30th highest hourly volume. And so because that is a sensitive hour, they're using that in some cases to be the design hourly volume, because that is a turning point, so to speak. And so the 30th highest hourly volume is kind of hard to wrap your mind around it. So let me try and illustrate. In this way, I want to give you a scenario here. Just imagine we put one of those traffic tubes out on the roadway, and the vehicles are traveling on them, and we kept it out there for an entire year. And so we had the traffic that's recorded for every single hour in 1 year, and then we ranked each one of those recorded hours from the highest number of vehicles to the lowest number of vehicles. And so this may be the hour that created the highest number of vehicles, and down here would be the hour that created the 30th highest hour of vehicles. And so what if we had something that looked like this, where after we recorded all the vehicles in 1 year for every single hour, and then we ranked them from greatest to least, when we find that when that 30th hour, after ranking them, 30th hour provides the 680 vehicles, then we would call that our design hourly volume and use that in calculations later. So as a quick recap, if you wanted to know what your design hourly volume should be, and you had that information for all of the hourly volumes for an entire given year, you rank it and you pick the 30th highest hourly volume in that year, and that will give you a design hourly volume that you should use for your calculations going forward. The second option you have is you take the peak hour volume, and you can divide that peak hour volume by the peak hour factor. All right. Sometimes it can be written like that. You'll see a peak hour factor. If you don't know what that is, you can go back to one of the previous videos and check out the video on peak hour factor. But dividing the peak hourly volume by the peak hour factor, you can get a design hourly volume. So you can get design hourly volume this way or this way, and each one of them will provide you at least a good starting point, so that you don't have an under design. Now, you can look at this peak hour factor as like a factor of safety. So you don't want to just design for a load that you know is going to be there. You also want to design for some flexibility, some variations in the loads that we're expecting on, say, a bridge deck or a stairwell case. And so the same thing goes for traffic. You don't want to design for the volume that you're expecting. You want to provide a little bit of flexibility and variability of that traffic, and that's your design hourly volume. So, for example, let's say you were given a peak hour or peak rush hour period. You're estimating or assuming that, or you even observed that it was 630 vehicles that typically travel in that one lane during that rush hour period. And you've also calculated that there's a peak hour factor of 0.85. So your design hourly volume, in this case, would be 630 divided by 0.85. And again, you can look at it as a factor of safety, because at the end, after calculating this out, you end up getting 741.1 vehicles. And so that is the amount of vehicles that you're designing for, instead of just the 630. Now, here's just a really quick rule of thumb. If you ever needed to estimate something really, really quick, and all you had was the average daily traffic, so you only knew how many people were traveling per day, but you wanted to know, well, what does that look like in a peak hour? I kind of drew that before earlier, and you wanted to know what the peak hour of that daily traffic, how many people were traveling in that peak hour when it was, afternoon quitting time and everyone was leaving to work. So a good rule of thumb, a quick and dirty way to estimate that is to just take 8 to 12% of whatever your daily traffic is, and that gets you really close to what the peak hour would be. So 8 to 12%, or a good way of just making it nice and easy is 10% of your traffic in one day travels in that one peak hour period. And so that's just a quick and dirty way to estimate your peak hour if you have daily traffic. And in most DOTs has that information published on their website.